Mather Gorge Formation here is a little different than we saw at the last outcrop in that it has not been all ground up. In this you can see the original bedding, and if you are able to see the original bedding, you can see that it does some odd things here. You can follow one bed, for example, and it goes down here and then makes a sharp turn and comes back again. It's been tightly folded here. The rock here has been folded.
It's pretty straight to me.
And you can see it here.
Oh, there's a fold.
Comes back up.
Wow,
and
that's
then
a big
back
fold.
over again. These are very, very tight folds. The rock itself is fairly fine-grained. You can't really see the individual grains. It's a little bit too fine. It's a fine sandstone or siltstone here. I'm pointing that out because when we see our next rock unit, it's much, much coarser. That's one of the main differences between them. And so notice here that the grains themselves are quite fine-grained. It would be very nice if we could find some fossils in this. Unfortunately, if the estimate of the age here is correct, like about 600 million, this predates one of the big inventions in geology, and that is hard parts like skeletons, teeth, bones, and that's what normally is fossilized. So although there was life at this time, assuming it's anywhere in that neighborhood of age, the life did not have anything that would fossilize easily. And so fossils of this age are extremely rare. The soft parts just rot away and don't leave any remains. So we don't have fossil evidence for the age of this. In rocks that are just a little bit younger, you have hope of finding good fossils, and those fossils can put a date on it. Here you cannot. So this rock has certainly been deformed. You can see the folds here in the rock down. If you come and walk down, you could. Here's a very nice one right here. The rock tends to split in this direction.
So it splits in its layers?
It splits because of the metamorphism. Remember when I talked about metamorphic rocks, when you put this under pressure, it develops sheet silicates perpendicular to the pressure. The sheet silicates all split very easily, parallel to the sheets, and if the rock has a lot of sheet silicates in it, it too will split along the direction of the sheets. And that's the cleavage in the rock that you're seeing here. That's these flat surfaces that all are running more or less in this direction. It's what's called a metamorphic foliation. It comes from the Latin word for leaf, which is folium. So that's the origin of the splitting that you see here. The rocks are low grade right here. Some of this rock in other parts of this region, the same rock was actually metamorphosed to a high grade, actually to the point where it started melting. The rock that I showed you in the lab that had a chunk of rock about this big, showing partly melted lines in it, enclosed in a different rock, that also was Mather Gorge, but from a different part of the formation where it went down deeper and was cooked to the point where it partly melted. So here it's low grade, there it was high grade, anywhere in between. Any questions? Yeah.
Was the river once higher than this? 'Cause
Oh,
I see
yes. Glad you asked that question.
all the rocks.
This is the Mather Gorge Formation, and geographically, this steep valley with cliffs along the side is Mather Gorge, named for Stephen Mather, one of the originators of the National Park System. This gorge was named for him. Now, if you were here a couple of million years ago, before the Ice Age, before billions of tons of water, or billions of cubic miles of water, were tied up in the ice caps in Antarctica and Greenland, sea level was about 300 feet higher because there was so much more water in the oceans. That water is now frozen at the two ends of the Earth. Most of it in Antarctica, but a significant amount in Greenland. When that first happened, the rivers here flowing down from inland North America found themselves perched 300 feet above the new sea level. And they immediately started cutting down. And they cut down, well, they've cut down several hundred feet. And that was the origin of the gorge. All the rivers in Maryland and Pennsylvania, when they approach the fall line, they've all cut these canyons or gorges into the edge of the bedrock. And the erosion works its way back upstream. The erosion here has worked its way back up as far as Great Falls, a little bit upstream here. When we visit our third outcrop, we will be above the area where the river cut down. And there the Potomac Valley is a broad valley without any gorge, because the erosion never made it back that far. So that's the origin of this valley here. Now, in some places, such as over in the Frederick Valley, in one of the field trips we take there, we can see in a farmer's field, there are lots of rocks very much like Rose's pet rock. They're rounded cobbles and boulders that have been water-worn, and they're sitting in a field a couple of miles away from the Potomac River, except that they're sitting about 200 or 300 feet higher than the level of the river. And they date back to a time when the river had not yet cut down. As the river cut down, as it still is doing today.
How long would that have been approximately?
We don't have a good date on that.
What is your guess?
My guess would be 10 million years.
Okay.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, the same thing is true in Kentucky, where I worked doing geology. I was hired by the U.S. Geological Survey to do, among other things, to map one of the quadrangles and produce a geological map from the topo map. And one of the things they have there is old channels of the Kentucky River that are sitting 300 or 400 feet above the present level of the river. And one of the questions that is asked is exactly that question. And nobody has more than a good guess on it. When I was working there, I thought I found a tooth in the gravels that were laid down by the river. And if I've got a tooth, some paleontologist is going to be able to tell me that's a tooth of something or other saurus and give me a date on the gravel. And I thought, oh, gee. So I showed it around the office to all the other geologists. This turns out to be a critical part of it. And they all agreed that this was really nice and we ought to send it to the paleontologists to identify it. So I duly sent it off. Of course, everything I collect in the line of my work, that's USGS property. I'm not supposed to keep anything for myself. And I got back a note a couple of weeks later saying this was actually the casing of a bullet and that they didn't do ballistics. So,
oh my goodness.
Anyway, it turns out they still don't know the age of those gravels or the gravels here. But something like that is how they would identify the age of those rocks. Find some fossil that was laid down in those gravels, and a tooth is a good possibility, and use that tooth to identify the age of the rock. By the principle of faunal succession, that is, each time period has its own characteristic fossils.
How far down does the gorge go?
Well, the gorge would actually continue down below Little Falls, except that the lower part of the gorge is drowned because the sea level went down even further during the height of the Ice Age. We're still in part of the Ice Age now with all that ice tied up in Antarctica. Sea level's going to rise another 300 feet when that melts. At the height of the Ice Age, it was about 300 feet lower than it is now, and the gorge would have been cut down even lower. But now that sea level has risen back up again, that lower part of the gorge is all filled in, partly with water the estuary of the Potomac River, and partly with sediment, which is all dumped in it. There's a really big gorge of the Nile River. Surely you've heard of the spectacular Nile Gorge, 1.5 miles deep. No? Cairo sits in it. Or actually, Cairo sits on top of it because 6 million years ago the Mediterranean went dry. The Straits of Gibraltar closed as Africa moved just a little bit closer to Europe, and you could walk across. Now, the Mediterranean climate is warm and dry, and if there is no water coming in from the Atlantic, it's warm enough and dry enough that more water evaporates than comes in by precipitation, by rain. And you do that for a little while after you've cut the Mediterranean off and it all dries up. And the level of the Mediterranean was maybe 8,000 or 10,000 feet lower than it is today. It became one searingly hot, dry desert. And the Nile River was still getting its rain from the mountains in Central Africa, and it was still flowing down. And when the Mediterranean went dry, the Nile immediately went to work cutting its way back down through the edge of the continent. And it cut the Nile Canyon. But then Gibraltar opened up again. The water came back in, sea level went to where it is today, and the canyon filled up with all the mud that the Nile was bringing down. So the Nile Canyon is still there, it's just filled with 1.5 miles of mud. Wow. That's why you don't get to see it. And the same thing would be true here, except not nearly as spectacular.
Except sonically.
Yes, you get to see it using vibrations from earthquakes, artificial or natural, because earthquake waves will go down through the sediment and then bounce off the rock at the bottom, come back up again, and you can tell how deep the rock is by how long it takes for the bouncing to go. It's basically an echo. Okay, let's head back to the restroom. As a geologist, by the way, and as a bird watcher, I often find myself quite a ways from the nearest restroom.
Well, I'm glad someone said